On this episode of Retro Car Guy 530, I'm going to replace the rear wheel bearings on my 2014 Chevrolet Caprice PPV. So, let's get into it. This video is broken into a variety of chapters. If there's one of particular interest to you, look at the time index and jump to that section, or expand the description section of this video and use the link in that section. Now, let's get into the video. Last week, I replaced the rear passenger wheel bearing on my 2014 Chevrolet Caprice PPV, and unfortunately, I can only get one done on that first day. Smoke issues in the area prevented me from completing the passenger side rear bearing, so I'm going to go through that today. I replaced the knuckle and bearing on the other side, and it solved a loose bearing issue that I had on the passenger rear side. Don't believe I have that same issue here, but if not, I'll show you the looseness that I found on the passenger rear. So on the driver's side rear, I'm just going to hopefully take all the lessons I've learned from the other side and capture it on video for you so you can see what I'm doing. So let's start the procedure. Here are all the tools that I'll be using in this procedure. I gathered quite a few of them in the process on the passenger rear side replacement last week. We're going to do the driver's side rear on this particular procedure. I have some special service tools that made it a bit easier. And there you can see the new knuckle and the new stub axle wheel hub that I'm going to be installing on this side. I do need to remove the existing stub axle to get to the backing plate for the parking brake to switch it over to this knuckle. And I use that 10-pound slide hammer to perform that procedure, which is a deviation from the service manual, but it worked quite well on the passenger rear, so we'll do that same thing today. Here I have the vehicle jacked up on a jack stand with one of my spare wheels and tires underneath as a safety precaution. And I'm going to demonstrate the amount of bearing play. And the reason I say it's bearing play is I'm going to show you with the parking brake on, there's virtually none. And with the parking brake off, you can actually hear an audible clicking, knocking. So here's with the parking brake on. There's no movement. So let me go turn off the parking brake. I now have the parking brake off. Now listen to it. You might be able to see it as well. There's an audible noise there. And I can feel the wheel move on the top to bottom direction. And not so much the front to back. It's always top to bottom, from what I can tell. And I can feel it move, so it's a metallic kind of feeling. It's not a bushing softness feeling, so that's why I'm going to go ahead and replace these wheel bearings and hopefully improve this situation quite a bit. I'm now going to use my shop press to press in the two Timken bearings that I have for these rear knuckles on my 2014 Chevrolet Caprice. I'm going to point out here that there's a magnetic ring on one side of the bearing for the wheel speed sensor. You need to press that into the knuckle, and there's a backing ring on the other side that will stop the travel of the bearing. But the wheel speed sensor is on that other side, so make sure you put that magnetic ring downward as you press in the bearing. I'm going to lubricate the knuckle side here, and I'm also going to do that with the bearing. I put the bearings into a freezer for about an hour to help shrink the outside diameter of the bearing. I put the bearing into the knuckle and I get that seated evenly, and I'm going to get a bushing from a bearing press kit that I have to make sure that it fits within this, and it's a 8.1 centimeter or 3.2 inch outside diameter, which fits within the inside diameter of the knuckle. And it also fits on the outside edge of the bearing, so I'm going to use that to press it into the knuckle. And I put an extra one to take up the excess space between the shop press and the top of the knuckle, and I press this in. And like I said, there's a bottom ring that you press the bearing up against, and that's the full travel. And now I'm going to install the clip for the bearing, and it's a Timken retaining clip, as is the bearing, and you see the part info over on the right side there. We now have the clip fully installed on the left side, and now we're going to repeat this process again on the right knuckle. Again, the bearing was in the freezer for about an hour using the same bushing press plate from my bearing press kit, and we're going to press this in. I'm going to think I have it all the way down, so I'm going to flip it over, which is a little bit hard to see in this sped up footage, but I'll check it to make sure it's pressed up against the ring on the back side, and again that magnetic ring is facing the inside of the knuckle. And with that fully pressed in, we're going to then put that clip in to complete the installation here. And the next part is to get that parking brake backing plate installed on here. Then we can press in the wheel hubs or the stub axles, depending on what you want to call them. And then we can get this installed in the vehicle. Let's start off by removing the brake caliper by removing the 2 securing bolts from the back of the knuckle. Then I'll set the brake caliper on the top, and I don't have a great way of securing it on the top there with any kind of hook, so I'll just set it up on the top, and then we'll be able to remove the brake rotor. We now have the brake caliper out of the way and the rotor off, and this exposes the parking brake backing plate. Once we get the stub axle off, which I'll be using a slide hammer in a little bit to do that, we'll be able then to pull this off and put it on the new knuckle that we're installing. So we have this off to the top. That should be sufficient. Don't really have anything to hang it from easily without it getting in the way. So now we're going to address the axle nut here, and it's got 2 indents in it to secure it into place, and now we need to chisel those out to allow us to get that removed, and I'll be using a special service tool to hold this. So let's get that installed first. Protect the ground, and this is a Kent Moore KM-468-C. I'm going to attach the special service tool to the stub axle lugs, and then I'm going to chisel out the retaining portions of the axle nut and remove that one-time use axle nut from the drive shaft. Alright, we have this on. The locking chunks of the axle nut are removed. We have the 36mm wrench for it. Alright, let's get this removed. Pressure will be taken, and I put a board down here so it doesn't dig into my concrete here. There's the original axle nut with the washer. There is no supplemental washer as per the parts diagrams. This is the only washer present. I'm now going to remove that special service tool from the stub axle lugs, and I'll use it again installing the new axle nut at the end of this procedure. Next, we're going to press out the axle from the hub. We're going to actually take off the bolts here, but we're going to mark all these bolts first. Make sure we get them back in their original spot, and get this pressed out by dropping the knuckle to the edge here, and then put the knuckle back in place with the bolts loosely put in place. And then I'm going to use the slide hammer to pull the stub axle out to get this backing plate with the parking brake transferred over. So let's mark all the bolts. And mark everything towards the inner part of the vehicle. The reason that I'm marking the bolt heads and the nuts and their mounting locations is to get the installation of this back as close as possible until I can take the vehicle for a full alignment after this procedure is completed. Wheel speed sensor is here, and it has a clip into the knuckle that we need to remove as well. There's an E8 that is used to secure that in there, and we're going to remove that at this point. this E8. Extracting the wheel speed sensor retaining clip from the knuckle is a little challenging, but I used 2 flat blade screwdrivers to pry out enough of it to be useful in the new knuckle, but make sure you store the wheel speed sensor in a safe location while you're performing this procedure. I use an 18mm wrench and an 18mm impact socket on my impact gun. I'm loosening the upper control arm bolt, but I have those marks so I can put them back in the original position. And I'm loosening these in preparation of dropping the knuckle down to extract the drive axle from the stub axle. I will have an issue with the trailing arm bolt. It's actually installed reverse of what the service manual shows. The lower control arm bolt here is fine, but the trailing arm one is actually reversed. The nut is on the left side of this picture where I have the impact gun right now, and according to the service manual it should be the head of the bolt there and the nut towards the center. It doesn't seem to make a big difference overall from what I can tell, but I'm going to install it the way the service manual shows. Now we're going to spray some penetrating lube here, PV blaster. And then get this special service tool, which is a Kentmore J42129. The 7208s, which aren't available anymore, are superseded by 7208As that are listed in the service manual in certain sections. They don't fit. This is the only one that seems to actually fit. So both tools are referenced in the service manual, but this is the only one that actually fits the lug pattern here. And I've got 3 14mm by 1.5 lugs here that I have spare that are not originally from the vehicle, but I'm going to use those to secure this onto the existing lugs. And I'm going to use this also to use my slide hammer to pull the stub axle out. And then put this into the center locating hole on the axle. These are pressed in pretty firmly, so that's going to take a little bit of effort. Let's see if we can do it with a ratchet. So, now that we've got those marked up here, we can remove the bolts. With the upper bolts removed from the knuckle, I'm using the extra distance that allows the knuckle to move to push the drive axle out using the special service tool. And once that's pushed out, I move it off to the left here to get it out of the way. Then I move the knuckle back into its normal position, install the bolts temporarily, but not fully tightened bolts, and then I install the special service tool, but with the 10-pound slide hammer attached to it this time. And then I use the 10-pound slide hammer to extract the stub axle from the bearing inner races in the knuckle. And that allows me access then to the backing plate mounting bolts, which allows me to transfer over to the brand new knuckle. GM issued Bulletin PI 1263 in June of 2014 to revise the service procedure to remove the stub axle or the wheel hub spindle, depending on your terminology, from the rear wheel bearing inner race. You use the special service tool from Kentmore DT51438, which is simply a punch that's shaped correctly to fit inside the inner race of the rear wheel bearing, and it basically allows you to hit the spindle portion out of the inner race. That's somewhat similar to what I'm doing, except I'm using a slide hammer to pull it out. This is using a punch to punch it out, so pick the appropriate procedure for you. I just didn't want to have to buy yet another special service tool to complete this task. Let's get the backing plate off. We need an E18 for that, for the bottom two. A 15 for the top. Now that we have this backing plate off, I can simply clean this up a little bit, blow it off, and then resecure it onto the new knuckle before pressing in the stub axle on the new one, which I will do off car. I'm going to take this, put it on the new knuckle, get that prepped and ready to go, but let's go ahead and get this old knuckle off, and we'll look at the bushings here. You'll see how deteriorated they are. Here's the knuckle with the stub axle pulled out. We have half the inner race still in here in the back, and you can see the ball bearings there from the outer section. This bearing actually didn't seem to have that much of a problem, although the bushings here, of course, are a bit looser than the new ones. I don't see any breakdown as far as the rubber, but they're certainly loose. And let's go ahead and get that backing plate for the parking brake transferred over, and then get the stub axle pressed into the new knuckle and get that knuckle on and get this done. This is the new knuckle for the left rear, so I'm going to install the parking brake backing plate and get the 3 bolts installed and torqued. Then I'll press the new stub axle into the new bearing using this bearing press kit that I have, and let's get that going. I've already blown this off, get all the excess brake dust out of here. And I'm going to put a little bit of orange Loctite. So this is the top bolt, the non-e-Torx bolt. So I'm just putting a little dab there. Same for the 2 e-Torx heads that I'm going to be putting back in place here. Just a little bit of Loctite. There we go. And we need the 15 for up here, which I have left over on the other side, so let's get that. An E18 socket is used to tighten the 2 lower bolts to 37 foot-pounds, then plus 60 degrees, and a 15mm socket is used to tighten the upper bolt to 43 foot-pounds. I'm now going to lubricate the inner races with some oil from my 70-year-old oil can here. Also, I'm going to lube with the outside of the stub axle casing here. Now that we have that lubricated on both sides, I'm going to set this in. There's a taper to it here. It should begin to engage the outer but inner race. I'm going to use this tool to press this in. Going to lubricate it as well. So what's going to happen here is this is going to go, I have a 955-8, which will sit on the inner race here. And it will not go, it'd be nice if it were just a hair bigger, but the kit doesn't have one. And then I don't want this pushing inward because it will sit in there, but that will prevent the hub from coming in all the way through. So it goes this way. And we have a washer. Then we have our hub. Which again we need to start in a secure fashion here. Nice even. But first let's get the cap on here. And there's a cap that goes over the outer edge here. Sits on that, so we'll pull evenly on that. Have a washer. And then the threads of this. So let's get this started so it's nice and even. Make sure we're not outside the race here. And we're even now. This is a 32 for the long nut. And I don't have one large enough, so I'm going to have to use a crescent wrench, adjustable wrench for that. A few minutes and tired arms later, the bearing press kit suggests not to use an impact wrench while installing bearings. And you can see it's been pressed in just about to the edge. That's why the other side of that bushing that where was it here? That's why we couldn't use this side of it, because that would have blocked its full travel into this section. We have the magnetic ring there, all intact. And it's nice and smooth and quiet. No wobbling on the stub axle. So, we're basically ready to start putting this back into the vehicle. We're going to, of course, after this and the front suspension work that I'll be doing, get a four-wheel alignment, but I've marked everything, so I'm going to pretty much leave it at the original alignment specs, since things were doing well, especially after replacing the right rear. It basically solved my vibration issue that I was having out of this because of the looseness in the bearing. But let's get this installed in the vehicle. I'm going to lube the splines of the drive axle here and also of the stub axle. So it says to use some gear lube. Let's pause the video for a second, and please note that I'm installing the bolt per the service manual for the trailing arm. When I removed it, it actually had the bolt coming from the rear of the vehicle through the trailing arm and the nut on the front side. So in this particular case, I'm following the service manual. It doesn't seem to matter which direction it's installed because they both seem to have ample space, but I'm following the service manual. I'm going to insert the drive axle spline into the stub axle, getting that started. And then I'm going to use the new axle nut to draw the stub axle onto the spline of the drive shaft, but not fully drawing it into it. That will come later when I use the special surface tool to help apply the proper torque. This is to give the proper spacing to allow the knuckle to be installed in the 4 mounting locations on the rear suspension. I'm now installing the 4 bolts that mount the knuckle to the rear suspension. 3 of those bolts have nuts that secure them, and they're one-time use nuts, so make sure you use brand new ones when installing them in the vehicle. I'm using a red pull strap to pull in the lower control arm bushing hole to the lower control arm bolt hole, so that worked out quite well. And I'm leaving the bolts loose because you have to actually place the vehicle at ride height, and I'm going to show you how to do that a little bit later in the video. Confirm that you have attached the parking brake cable to the hook on the back of the backing plate, and also the rubber grommet that holds the outside of the cable in the knuckle. Make sure that's fully installed. The service manual states that you must leave the 4 bolts that secure the knuckle to the rear suspension loose until you have the vehicle at normal ride height with the wheel on the vehicle. I'm going to simulate that by using a scissor jack to elevate the knuckle and thus the rear suspension to normal ride height. I'm going to raise it up to the point where it just about takes the weight off the jack stand that I have underneath the vehicle, and then I'll use that as ride height. Then I'll torque the 4 bolts involved to the specifications on the screen. I reinstalled the Kentmore KM468-C special service tool to allow me to torque the axle nut. First pass, 111 foot-pounds. $111.3. Then second, loosen the nut by 180 degrees. Third pass is to 37 foot-pounds. 37. Okay. And then 45 degrees. I'm going to have to redo this again to have it set on the bottom. And the last pass is 45 degrees. So I'll start here, and it should be horizontal when I'm done. All right. Now we crimp the nut. First, I removed the special service tool from the stub axle lugs. All right, now we're going to crimp the nut so it won't loosen. Let's flip it around. Let's get the wheel speed sensor back in place. Click. All right, we have all the bolts for the knuckle tightened to spec. We have the wheel speed sensor installed, the little clipped into the retainer on the knuckle. We have the axle nut torqued to the specifications in the alternative method, and we'll get the caliper back on as soon as we get the rotor on. The brake shoes should be adjusted because I haven't changed anything, so I shouldn't have to readjust. And I found that to be true when I performed this on the other side. So I'm going to spray a little bit of fluid film on here to make everybody happy, even though it's not really required here for this area. That way anyone else taking this off shouldn't run into a problem. Make sure we don't get any on the shoes here. And use one of my alternative lug nuts here to hold the rotor up against the hub. Now reinstall the brake caliper and the brake caliper mounting bracket, which I left as one assembly. Make sure you don't get a kink in the hose. Make sure there's no extra twist in the hose. Make sure the brake shoes are properly seated in the caliper, and then reinstall that. The torque specifications for the brake caliper mounting bracket bolts are first pass 30 foot-pounds, and then the second pass you go an additional 90 degrees. With that fully installed, I then pump the brakes to make sure that the piston is fully seated like it should be and the brake shoes are fully engaged like they should be. Then I get the wheel installed, get it back on the ground, and I go for a test drive, finding great success. Everything's nice and quiet and the ride is much better. Make sure that you're aware that I did torque the suspension bolts in an earlier section of this video. The service procedure does state to get the vehicle back on the ground to do that, but I simulated that as I explained earlier in the video. But if you didn't do it in that manner, make sure you do that before you get the vehicle out on the road again. And hopefully your repair is as successful as mine has been on my 2014 Chevrolet Caprice PPV. I decided to purchase new knuckles from rockauto.com and carid.com because RockAuto didn't have the rear left knuckle, and I did that because they came with new bushings already installed, and that way I didn't have to worry about dealing with the pressing out of the bearings or anything while I'm trying to do the installation of the parts on the car. Neither rockauto.com or carid.com were sponsors of anything in this video. I paid for everything with my own money. Did I learn some lessons? Certainly. The installation of the stub axle or wheel hub assembly off the vehicle may have been a little bit easier with the knuckle hanging on the rear suspension. Same with the parking brake backing plate. The lower bolts that needed the 37 foot-pounds plus 60 degrees may have been easier to torque while on the vehicle. And it's just a lot easier if you don't have to hold it with one hand and torquing something with another hand. So I've learned some lessons. This video is not intended to be a how-to, it's how I address the issue on my vehicle, which again is a 2014 Chevrolet Caprice PPV. If you learned something from it, great. It's meant for entertainment purposes, but if you found something in this to be informational or you liked it, make sure you hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit that bell notification to be notified when I upload new videos just like this to the channel. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.